Hello, this is again Dr. Jehonathan Bentovich, and I'm here on a very special day in the Chabad tradition with commemoration of the third Chabad rabbi special date, um, and Kaf Kislev. And I want to present on this very special day. I want to present a very significant presentation, which is an overview and a highlighting of the new scientific paradigm of 21st century physics and science more generally, which is the new God's physics paradigm. As I said, there's been the God's physics book, a new scientific paradigm for the 21st century. This was published by iUniverse.com, and it was written and now published all over the world, and it's being translated to different languages. It was written essentially to the general public because I believe that the scientific revolution that we're undergoing now and the basic acceptance of the scientific community increasingly of this new God's physics paradigm. Previously it was called the Computational Unified Field Theory, and the reason for this acceptance of this new God's physics or Computational Unified Field Theory paradigm as the new paradigm for 21st century physics, which I'm going to speak about, and I'm going to highlight also for the general public the exciting new windows of opportunities and windows of understanding of a completely new universe, something that we've not seen in a sense for 100 years. Einstein, I call this theory the Computational Unified Field Theory, and recently as God's physics new paradigm, because Einstein considered to be one of the two greatest geniuses the world has ever known, him and Isaac Newton, and Einstein's general theory of relativity is considered to be the greatest single intellectual achievement of a single human being. So Einstein, the great Einstein, for the second half of his illustrious scientific career, was looking for a new paradigm, a new theory, which he called the unifying field theory, or unified field theory, that would unify between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Einstein realized, this great genius, Einstein realized that science cannot remain in the state of affairs which it finds itself from essentially 1919, perhaps earlier, with the validation concurrently and even before the validation, the empirical validation of Einstein's back then new relativity theory, which became the new paradigm for 20th century physics. Later on, it was expanded or added to it quantum mechanics, which talks about the subatomic realm. But Einstein realized that a situation in which the two pillars of now the old 20th century physics, which is relativity theory, general relativity theory for the macroscopic world, universe at large, and quantum mechanics for the microscopic realm. Again, by the way, relativity theory discovered singularly by Einstein, and quantum mechanics begun by Einstein and then added other scientists. But in any event, Einstein realized that a situation in which the two pillars of science or physics, relativity theory and quantum mechanics, seem to contradict each other, that's an impossible situation for science. And he was not, by the way, alone. Essentially, what he highlighted, that science cannot remain in a situation where the two pillars of science or of physics seem to contradict each other for long. This is precisely what Thomas Kuhn, the great philosopher of science of 20th century science, also stated. He found out, by the way, Thomas Kuhn found out and became part of the essential knowledge of how science evolves. He discovered, Thomas Kuhn, that science is a human endeavor, and as a human endeavor, it's undergoing certain evolutionary phases. So he identified that science in general, any scientific discipline, would undergo essentially two basic phases of evolution, and they're alternating. You may say they're like a spiral that's going up as our understanding evolves, we're alternating between what the first phase, which is standard science, in which a standard paradigm, a certain paradigm, is accepted by the scientific community. Let's say, take the example of Newtonian mechanics. So for 19th century physics, Newtonian mechanics was the standard paradigm, even before, but let's say in 19th century, physicists have already accepted Newtonian mechanics as the standard paradigm which allows science to function, to investigate the physical reality, and it was useful for a while. But then Thomas Kuhn teaches us, and Einstein followed his analysis in a sense by seeking this unifying field theory. So then the standard paradigm is no longer sufficient. So in other words, it reaches a dead end. It reaches the limit of its usefulness, and the symptoms for that situation, which we call a paradigmatic crisis, preceding a paradigmatic shift into the new paradigm. The symptoms of this paradigmatic crisis, as Thomas Kuhn analyzed it, are two major things. One is that there seems to be a contradiction between the two pillars of the old standard paradigm. In the case of Newtonian mechanics, there seemed to be a contradiction between Newtonian mechanics of 19th century and Maxwellian electromagnetic theory of 19th century. So they were apparently contradicting each other. Now we stand at an equivalent point, because general relativity theory and quantum mechanics, both of these are part of what I call the old material causal paradigm, which I'll explain briefly. Those two pillars of the old standard paradigm seem to contradict each other. And so that's a symptom, Thomas Kuhn taught us, that's a symptom of the paradigmatic crisis, of a situation that science, in a sense, is signaling that it has to expand, has to replace the old standard paradigm into a new paradigm which is much more exhaustive. And the second symptom is when we find that the old standard paradigm cannot explain a series of phenomena, or at least one major phenomenon cannot be explained by the old standard paradigm. That also is an indication, Thomas Kuhn teaches us, of a paradigmatic crisis, in a sense of the inadequacy of the old standard paradigm to continue to serve science and humanity more generally as a means for discovering truth, advancing towards the ultimate discovery of the real nature of the universe. And the second symptom, by the way, in the case of Newtonian mechanics, that was the purely hypothetical ether concept. The ether concept was a purely hypothetical concept, assuming in 19th century Newtonian mechanics science, assuming that the universe is perfused, is filled with a very fine element which was called the ether. And this very fine element was a basis for the whole of Newtonian mechanics. So the hypothetical existence of the ether was like a major pillar, a major foundation for this whole structure of the old Newtonian mechanics. And when scientists were looking for this purely hypothetical ether concept for a while, and they could not find it, the most famous experiment, the Michelson-Morley experiment, failed. In other words, it wasn't able to detect this ether concept, this purely hypothetical ether concept. And again, we see the genius of Einstein coming in and saying, well, science cannot remain in a situation where we have this purely hypothetical ether concept, which is a basis for Newtonian mechanics. It cannot be found, so we have to discard it. And so he said, the ether is superfluous. We don't need it, and it doesn't exist, so he discarded it. And then he obviously advanced with a few postulates, theoretical postulates, to build this new paradigm, this new beautiful paradigm of relativity theory, general relativity theory, which was accepted in 20th century physics as the new paradigm. And now we stand at an equivalent point, because now we have, as we said, the two pillars of the old material causal paradigm, relativity theory and quantum mechanics. These two models of relativity theory and quantum mechanics seem to contradict each other. I'll explain perhaps briefly what this is about, but in a sense they are seeming to contradict each other. So that's one symptom of what Thomas Kuhn said, this is a paradigmatic crisis. And the other thing is that like the ether concept, now there are purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, which again, for 2 decades, 2 full decades of investigation, scientific experimentation, could not be found. And so I've called scientists to discard this purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy, by the way, comprising or assumed to comprise up to 95% of all the matter and energy in the universe. And again, just as Einstein declared, science cannot remain in such a situation in which 95% of all the matter and energy in the universe are assumed, are hypothetical, and cannot be detected. They have to be discarded. So there were over now between 50 and 60 peer-reviewed scientific articles published, 2 special issues, now a 3rd special issue coming out. I'm opening international conferences as a keynote opening talk about this new paradigm, and one of those 50 to 60 scientific articles published, I've actually called, like Einstein, I've called for discarding dark matter and dark energy as superfluous, as non-existent. And obviously this new God's physics paradigm is offering now a new solution, a new alternative, much broader and very elegant, very beautiful model for the universe, which discards dark matter, dark energy, and allows for a new understanding of the universe. Excuse me. And so, essentially, we've gotten to the point now in this presentation, in this lecture, to understanding that just alike the paradigmatic crisis, which led to a paradigmatic shift towards the new paradigm of 20th century physics, that was relativity theory and later on quantum mechanics, just as science has undergone a paradigmatic crisis from Newtonian mechanics, in which Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian theory seem to contradict each other, in which the ether concept was a major phenomenon that could not be verified, and therefore Thomas Kuhn taught us, and Einstein demonstrated that when we have this paradigmatic crisis exhibited in science, it leads to a paradigmatic shift. There has to be a new paradigm that can resolve the apparent contradiction between the 2 pillars of the standard paradigm, the old standard paradigm. So can resolve this apparent contradiction, and also can explain this unexplained phenomena in the case of 20th century, 19th century Newtonian mechanics. Einstein's new general relativity theory discarded the ether concept and offered an alternative explanation. And so we stand at an equivalent historic point in which the 2 pillars of modern physics, of 20th century physics, relativity theory about the macroscopic world, quantum mechanics about the microscopic world, they seem to contradict each other. That's a clear sign of a paradigmatic crisis. Then this major unexplained phenomena of dark matter and dark energy, comprising up to 95% of all the mass and all the energy in the universe, cannot be detected even after 2 decades, full decades of experimentation. By the way, there's been a special issue of Scientific American recently coming out with an article whose title was The Last Stand of Dark Matter, Dark Energy. Essentially, science is realizing the fact that this situation in which dark matter and dark energy are considered to be real but yet cannot be detected, this situation cannot stand for long. So it's the last stand of dark matter, dark energy. In other words, the scientific community is starting to realize that dark matter and dark energy cannot hold for much longer, and that in a sense science is undergoing this paradigmatic crisis and ensuing paradigmatic shift towards a new satisfactory paradigm. And what I'm here to talk about is that the scientific community is recognizing the fact that now we have a new paradigm, a new satisfactory paradigm for 21st century theoretical physics and science more generally, which is this new God's physics paradigm. And the reason that I'm stating that is that just as when Einstein's general relativity theory came out, and he wanted to prove, and this is also part of Thomas Kuhn's analysis, when Einstein wanted to prove that his general theory of relativity is in fact the new paradigm, new satisfactory paradigm for 20th century physics, what did he do? He identified a special, unique, critical prediction for which his theory of relativity prediction would be very different than the prediction of the old standard paradigm, Newtonian mechanics paradigm. And that, in the case of Einstein, that was the curvature, the double-valued curvature pathway or perihelion pathway of Mercury around the Sun. So Einstein identified a specific prediction about Mercury's perihelion pathway around the Sun, or double-valued curvature pathway around the Sun. He identified the fact that according to his new understanding, or his new general relativity theory understanding of the universe, because massive objects are assumed to bend the fabric of space-time, that brings about a much more curved pathway of Mercury around the Sun. And then when Eddington in 1919, famous solar eclipse expedition, set out to validate Einstein's new paradigm, at that time, the moment that Eddington verified that Einstein's unique prediction of the value of Mercury's pathway or curvature around the Sun would be 1.6 arc and not 0.8 as Newtonian mechanics predicted, because it was a unique critical prediction contrasting general relativity theory and the old paradigm, standard paradigm of Newtonian mechanics. The moment that Einstein's prediction was validated, and Eddington verified that it's 1.6 rather than 0.8, at that moment, historic moment, the scientific community had to accept the new relativity theory paradigm. And what I'm saying here, and I've lectured about this, again, published multiple articles, but it's important for me to deliver this important message to the general public and to all scientists, as well as I'm doing when I'm opening such keynote opening talks, such as in the Aerospace 2021 in Paris, which I just delivered, essentially telling the world, telling scientists, telling the layman audience and the world that we have a new paradigm of 21st century physics and science, and that's based on the initial empirical validation of two critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm, which I'm going to talk about briefly. But in any event, we have now, just as in Eddington's case, verification of the new paradigm. We have now an empirical validation of this new paradigm, this new God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm. So it's a very exciting time, and because this new understanding revises quite dramatically our understanding of the universe, its origination, its sustenance, its evolution, and its evolution actually towards a perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state. This is an exciting time, and this is a very important message for the world, for science, for the general humanity audience and listeners. So I think the next step in this important presentation is to explain briefly what the old paradigm, the old scientific paradigm of 20th century physics, which I call the material causal paradigm, what did that old paradigm tell us about the universe, and then explain how it's how the new paradigm. We already stated that the old paradigm has reached a paradigmatic crisis, and that there is a necessity to transition to this, make a paradigmatic shift to the new God's physics paradigm. So I need to explain now to the general public the tenets and the basic assumption, material causal assumption of the old paradigm, 20th century relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and then explain how this is transitioning towards the new exciting God's physics paradigm and what the essence of that is. If I had to explain it very briefly, I did it in previous presentations as well. The old material causal paradigm assumes that everything in the universe operates by cause and effect. And cause and effect meaning that, for example, the origination of the universe is assumed to have been caused by an initial nuclear event, the Big Bang nuclear event. So essentially, we had a lump of very condensed matter. That lump of matter underwent a nuclear event, which then created the galaxies, the suns, the planets, all the space and time and energy and mass in the universe. That's cause and effect. So the old material causal paradigm tells us or assumes that the origination of the universe, the expansion of the universe by purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy, everything in the universe is operating by cause and effect. By the way, so the example I gave was about the relativity theory, telling us that there was this Big Bang nuclear event. It created mass, energy, planets, galaxies, etc. That's on the macroscopic scale of general relativity theory, and the microscopic scale of quantum mechanics. It's also cause and effect, because it's assuming that when we want to measure any subatomic target particle, the measurement depends on the interaction, the direct physical interaction of the particle that we want to measure, the target subatomic particle, which is assumed to have a probability wave function or dispersed along a probability wave function. And that target element then is impacted by another subatomic probe element, and that impact creates or causes the collapse of the target's dispersed probability wave function into a single complementary space-time energy mass measured value for the target element. So also in quantum mechanics, we see cause and effect, material causality. So that's the old paradigm. And the old paradigm, by the way, affects very much our thinking, because not just for scientists, generally our thinking now is that everything in the universe is comprised of material entities, and everything is cause and effect. If there's a virus, then a person becomes ill, etc. But that's a material causal assumption, and that material causal assumption is undergoing now a profound paradigmatic shift, and that's probably a good a point or a good opening to explaining this new paradigm. So if we said the old material causal paradigm assumes that everything is cause and effect, that everything operates by material causality, we have interaction between let's say the Big Bang nuclear event and the creation of the universe. The collapse of the probability wave function, target's probability wave function, is caused, quote unquote, by its impact with the probe element, which causes the collapse of this probability wave function into a single complementary space-time energy mass value of the measured target particle. That's the old paradigm, and I'm reminding the viewers that old paradigm is in a sense crashing, or that old paradigm is in a sense inadequate, because it cannot explain where 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe exist. As we said, we have to discard dark matter, dark energy as superfluous, as non-existent, because they cannot be found, and because the old paradigm has such intrinsic basic inconsistencies or contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And perhaps I'll mention very briefly this contradiction, or one of the major contradictions between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. That contradiction has to do with the fact that according to relativity theory, there is a limit, the speed of light barrier limit, for the transmission of any signal across space and time. And I've given the example, I'm not the only one saying that, but if we took the example, for example, of the sun, and our perception, our reception of light from the sun, it takes about 8 minutes for the light to reach from the sun to planet Earth. And there is a cause and effect there, in the sense, or the speed of light barrier limit, because if, God forbid, the sun was to be extinguished, it would take 8 minutes until we on Earth would actually see that, until the last ray of light would reach the Earth. So there is a gap, there is a cause and effect, and a gap of the speed of light barrier where the event God forbid, the hypothetical event of the sun being extinguished, and then that's the cause and the effect. Until we actually see that, we cannot know that before the speed of light, the light ray would reach, the last light ray would reach Earth. And then on the other side, quantum mechanics, and especially the quantum entanglement phenomenon, tells us something completely different. That if we have two twin particles conjoined, and then they would separate, and we look for an equivalent situation where they're now separated by 8 minutes of light traveling distance. And let's say we measure one of these entangled particles, and then, according to quantum entanglement phenomena, which was verified in Bell's experiment, when we measure one of those particles, instantaneously, without the 8 minutes, instantaneously we've determined the results of the complementary measuring limit of the other entangled particle. So that seems to indicate that there is a violation of the speed of light barrier, because a measurement of this particle instantaneously affects the other particle. So that's a clear contradiction between what relativity theories, general relativity theory is telling us, and what quantum mechanics is telling us. And so that was the reason that the old paradigm, material causal paradigm, has reached its limit. And also, as we said, dark matter, dark energy, comprising up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, cannot be detected, so therefore they have to be discarded, right? So now we have to understand this shift, paradigmatic shift, necessary paradigmatic shift towards this new God's physics, computational unified field theory paradigm, which I also call the acausal computational paradigm, or acausal computation paradigm. And I'll explain in a second why this is necessary, or what that means. Essentially, the way to resolve this apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and also to explain in an alternative explanation the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which again, instead of dark matter, dark energy, which we've discarded because they cannot be found and for other theoretical reasons, so this new God's physics acausal computational paradigm explains the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion in a different way. So the way that this new God's physics paradigm, or computational unified field theory paradigm, explains resolves the apparent contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and explains the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion while discarding dark matter, dark energy. The way that this new God's physics paradigm does that is by discovering a singular, higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP. And essentially what that new UCP principle is telling us is that we have a new principle, a higher ordered computational or consciousness principle, which computes simultaneously every small pixel in the universe. Simultaneously. So it's creating every billionth or even trillionth of a second. It's computed by c² divided by Planck's constant, which gives us 1.36 in the power of minus 50. That's part of the new universal computational formula, which I'll talk about at the heart of this new God's physics paradigm. But essentially, this new UCP, universal computational / consciousness principle, is computing the whole universe each time as a universal frame. You may say a three-dimensional universal frame comprising the whole universe, and it's computed simultaneously by this UCP. And then after this universal computational principle, UCP is creating the whole universe as a three-dimensional simultaneous frame, universal frame, the whole frame dissolves back into this UCP. So the universe does not exist. It dissolves between one frame and the other frame. It dissolves back into this UCP, Universal Computational or Consciousness Principle. And then the UCP creates another frame, by the way, a larger frame. So every time it creates a frame of the universe, it adds a certain amount of exhaustive spatial pixels to the old frame, so the new frame is bigger than the old frame. That's part of the explanation of the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. There's another postulate there about special times, such as the collective human consciousness focus intervals or special times, such as the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, a New Year time interval, in which there is a leap in the rate of acceleration of the universe, which I'll talk about, I hope. But in any event, the idea is that this new paradigm discovered the existence of a singular, higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP, and that UCP creates the whole universe as a frame, and it exists. That frame exists for a trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second. It dissolves back into this UCP, and then immediately after that, subsequently, the UCP creates another frame, a larger frame of the universe, and this is going on continuously. So the discovery of this new higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle, UCP, the discovery of this new higher ordered UCP, continuously creating, dissolving, recreating, and evolving the universe, is a major discovery by this new God's physics paradigm. Very exciting and very profound, as we'll understand, very profound shift and alteration of our basic understanding of the universe. But before I'll get to that, essentially what we're saying is that since this UCP is creating simultaneously every frame, again, creating a frame, dissolving the frame, back into the UCP, creating a larger frame, dissolving the frame, creating a still larger frame, this continuous creation, dissolution, recreation, evolution of the universe, because the UCP is computing simultaneously the whole universe, this new paradigm, this new God's physics paradigm, is also an acausal computation paradigm. And what I mean by that is, because the UCP is creating simultaneously, imagine the whole universe is created simultaneously as a frame. So because it's created simultaneously, there cannot be any cause and effect between any spatial pixels comprising that frame. And in between one frame and another, there's a complete dissolution of the universe back into the UCP. So that means also between one frame and another, there cannot be any cause effect, because everything dissolves into the UCP. I give this metaphor, which I'm repeating every time, just because it's somewhat useful. I give this metaphor essentially saying cinematic film metaphor. I'm using the film metaphor, the cinematic film metaphor, to as an illustration for some of the highlights of this new model, so we can grasp it. And I said, if we had a glass of juice, and then we had a hammer hitting the glass of juice in a film, and the glass of juice is shattered and the juice is spilled over the table, what seems to be a cause and effect scenario, because we're seeing in the film the hammer hitting the glass juice, the glass juice being glass filled with juice is being shattered, and the juice is spilled over the table. This seems to be a cause and effect situation scenario. But when we slow down the progression of the film, we see that in none of these frames there is any cause and effect, because in all of the frames these two objects are being presented simultaneously. In the first frame they're somewhat apart, then they become closer and closer and closer. Even in the frame that they're touching upon each other, they're presented simultaneously. So if they're presented simultaneously, there cannot be any cause and effect. And obviously between one frame and another, these two objects are dissolving into the pure light. In the cinematic film metaphor, in the God's physics paradigm, these two objects are being dissolved back into this UCP. So there cannot be any cause and effect. But it seems to us as a cause and effect, because the director of the film is arranging the film frames in such a manner that the proximity of these objects becomes closer and closer. Then the object, the glass, the juice glass, or the glass filled with juice, is being shattered, and the juice is spilled over the table. So we are inferring that there is cause and effect. But in fact, there's no cause and effect. There cannot be any cause and effect, because they're being presented simultaneously in each of these frames, and in between the frames, they're dissolving back into the UCP. So what we're realizing is a new, what I call acausal computational paradigm, essentially telling us that the universe is not existing, is not functioning by cause and effect. The universe is evolving based on the UCP, the Universal Consciousness Principle or reality, producing a series of frames and presenting them in such an order that gives us the perception, the illusion, you may say, or the perception that there's cause and effect. But really, there's no cause and effect. Material causality is undermined. But what exists is the UCP that's creating the universe and arranging the universe and evolving the universe in a particular order and particular direction. So we're discovering a new, what I call acausal computation or computational paradigm that replaces the old paradigm of material causality. The world is not functioning by cause and effect. And this is perhaps a good point to mention what I already lectured about and wrote numerous articles, just to show how profound this change is. So, for example, one of the implications of this new acausal computational paradigm is that it challenges the Big Bang model. We cannot any longer assume that the universe was created by a Big Bang nuclear event. First of all, because if we were to go back to the initial frames of the universe, in the first initial frame of the universe, there could not have been any interaction between, let's say, the lump of matter and a nuclear event, and a Big Bang event, causing a Big Bang event. Because both the lump of matter and the nuclear event, they were occurring simultaneously. And so they could not interact with each other. And then if we looked at the second frame, third frame, fourth frame, nth frame, etc., we could not say that because of the nuclear event that interacted or acted upon the lump of condensed matter, that created in the second frame creation of suns, galaxies, and those suns, galaxies continued to create other suns or galaxies or expand. That could not happen because between one frame and another, the whole universe dissolves back into this UCP. And over and above, beyond that, the assumption that the universe was created by an initial Big Bang event and that created the suns, galaxies, and the initial accelerated expansion of the universe, that also could not be the case, simply because this new God's physics paradigm is telling us that the universe is being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved every trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second. So the universe was not just created, first it could not be created as a material causal interaction in the first or second or third frames, and over and beyond that, the universe really is being created, dissolved, recreated, and evolved by this UCP. The universe right now is being created and then dissolved and then recreated and evolved, and it's not because of the initial Big Bang nuclear event, because the nuclear event, if it took place, could not create the suns, the galaxies, and it dissolved back into this UCP. And so everything that's happening in the universe from its inception and concurrently and going forward is really a continuous creation, dissolution, recreation, and evolution of the universe only by this singular universal consciousness computational principle. That's the only thing that's driving the universe, is this universal consciousness principle, computational principle, UCP. Quite amazing. But it alters our understanding of the universe. The universe is not a static phenomena. It's not a material phenomena, material causal phenomena that's existing and that's progressing based on material causal interactions. In fact, there cannot be any material causal interactions as we understand it. There is a simultaneous creation of the whole universe and an evolution of the universe based on this singular higher order universal consciousness principle. That's a great, profound understanding, profound understanding of the universe. So we start looking at the universe in a completely different manner. And this is perhaps also a good point. At this point, let me just again revert back to the acceptance of this new paradigm and explain how this acceptance is taking place now. So we're saying, first of all, this new God's physics paradigm was able to resolve the apparent contradiction between relativity theory and quantum mechanics by discovering this singular higher order universal consciousness principle or computational principle, UCP, that's creating the whole universe all the time and dissolving and recreating, that brings about a new acausal computational paradigm, which tells us the universe is not a material entity that's just evolving by cause and effect. The universe is a dynamic creation and recreation of this universal consciousness principle, and it's being driven, it's being created, it's being evolved, sustained, and dissolved solely by this higher ordered, singular higher ordered universal consciousness slash computational principle. So now we are reaching the point, and I'll talk about in a bit. I'll talk about, for example, how this new God's physics paradigm offers an alternative explanation for the accelerated expansion of the universe, which, remember, this was a major problem in the old material causal paradigm of 20th century relativity theory and quantum mechanics. So now I think we reached the point where we have to highlight what is now a breakthrough in science, what is now an embracing of this new God's physics paradigm by the scientific community and by science, based on this empirical validation of two critical predictions, unique critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm, this Computational Unified Field Theory paradigm. And as I said, it's equivalent to Eddington's verification of Einstein's back then new relativity theory standard paradigm. This is exactly what's happening now. This is the reason that the scientific community has to accept and is accepting the new God's physics paradigm as the new satisfactory scientific paradigm, or theoretical physics paradigm for 21st century science. So I'll just explain very briefly these two empirical validations of two unique critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm. One of them has to do actually with what we spoke about, the accelerated expansion of the universe. As we said, the old paradigm, the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, assumed that the universe is expanding, has an accelerated rate of expansion due to the existence of purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts. And as we said, after 20 years of intensive experimentations, trying to find this highly elusive, and purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, after 2 decades of essentially a failure to detect those purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, the scientific community and science at large is starting to doubt the very existence of dark matter, dark energy. And I've actually discarded dark matter and dark energy, just as Einstein did for the ether, as I explained. But now I'm getting to the point of explaining how this new God's physics paradigm actually has a critical prediction, which is already initially validated, that essentially replaces the need for the dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts, which anyway have been discarded because they cannot be found. But that's an initial empirical validation of a critical prediction of this new God's physics paradigm. So one of those critical predictions has to do with the fact that, as I said, according to the God's physics new paradigm, Computational Unified Field Theory, the universe doesn't expand because of dark matter, dark energy. There's no cause and effect, as we said. The universe expands because this UCP, this singular higher ordered universal consciousness principle, is creating and recreating the universe all the time as a new appearance or a new creation of the universe, by creating this extremely rapid series of universal frames. And as we said, essentially this new God's physics paradigm is teaching us, postulating, that every time the UCP creates the universe, it creates the universe as a universal frame, and then it dissolves. It exists for maybe a trillionth of a trillionth, etc. of a second, for a very brief period of time, and then it recreates the universe as a larger frame. So the new frame, the subsequent frame, is bigger than the old frame, and so forth and so on. So in other words, the first frame, the second frame is larger than the first frame, the third is larger than the second, the fourth is larger than the third. The UCP is adding an accelerated number of exhaustive spatial pixels, of points to the universe every time that it creates the universe anew. Every time that it recreates a new frame, it adds an accelerated number of exhaustive spatial pixels, which gives us the measurement, the perception that the universe is expanding, and it's expanding at an accelerated rate. What this means, or what the critical prediction that ensues from this new discovery, is according to God's physics paradigm, the universe would be accelerating would be expanding at an accelerated rate, and that rate would undergo, that's another postulate of this God's physics new paradigm, the acceleration of the universe also undergoes certain periods of time in which there's a leap, there's a non-continuous increase, like a jump or a leap in the rate of the universe's expansion. That leap occurs, according to this new God's physics paradigm, at special time intervals in which there is collective human consciousness focus. Since this UCP is also a universal consciousness principle or reality, there is a postulate in this new God's physics beautiful theory, which is telling us that every time there is a collective human consciousness focus, every time there is a focus of many human beings, millions of human beings, on this universal consciousness principle, in religious terms we may call it God. So every time we have a collective human consciousness, millions of human beings focusing on this universal conscious reality or God, then we would see a non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. So that would mean that according to this new God's physics paradigm, one of the critical predictions, which I've called cosmologists, astronomers to test during this year as well, is that during, for example, the Jewish Rosh Hashanah New Year, 2 days every year in which the whole Jewish people, millions of Jews all over the world, all around the world, are praying and focusing on this universal conscious reality, i.e. God. So this year it occurred on 7th and 8th of September 2021. Every time you have this collective human consciousness, such as in the Jewish Rosh Hashanah New Year, which again this year was on the 7th and 8th of September, every time this happens, what takes place is essentially a non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. So we start seeing, so the critical prediction is, this is why I called cosmologists, astronomers to test this, that during a special time such as the Jewish Rosh Hashanah New Year on the 7th and 8th of September 2021 this year, you would see a non-continuous increase, leap, in the rate of the universe's expansion. So if it was x on the previous year, it would be x plus I plus a certain increase, non-continuous increase in the subsequent Jewish year. I'm still waiting for results to come in from these measurements from cosmologists and astronomers, but nevertheless, regardless of this specific verification on the 7th and 8th of September, which I'm still waiting for the communication of results, regardless of this specific measurement, the basic prediction or critical prediction of the new God's physics paradigm is that when we look over time regarding the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, it will not remain the same accelerated rate. There will be leaps, there would be increases every year, but over a period of time there will be increases in the rate of the universe's expansion, which are only predicted by this new God's physics paradigm, as opposed to the prediction of the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which assume that this rate of accelerated expansion should be the same, remain the same. And lo and behold, there's an initial experimental verification of this critical prediction of the new God's physics paradigm about the non-continuous increase or leaps, and over time a non-continuous increase in the rate of the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. There is already an empirical validation of this unique critical prediction of God's physics paradigm. And how so? Or how do we see that? Because I've published articles about this. There is a gap, an unexplained gap, the cosmological astronomical gap of the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. There's an unexplained gap. So when scientists, astronomers, cosmologists measure the rate of the universe's expansion at the initial stages of the universe with the background radiation, they found a certain value which is significantly smaller than the astronomical measurement of the accelerated rate of the universe expansion today. And that gap, in other words, today the universe is expanding at a higher, significantly higher rate than what was measured initially with the background radiation by cosmological measurements of the initial stages of the universe. So that is a verification that the universe has accelerated in a non-continuous manner, which is exactly the prediction of this new God's physics paradigm. So we see an initial empirical validation of one of the critical predictions that cannot be explained by the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and this new prediction about the non-continuous increase in the universe's accelerated rate of expansion is verified through this gap, this unexplained gap between the initial cosmological measurement of the universe's expansion rate and the contemporary measurement, astronomical measurement of the universe's accelerated rate, which is much higher. And that's a verification and validation, just as Eddington verified Einstein's general relativity theory critical prediction about Mercury's perihelion double-valued pathway curvature around the sun. This is precisely equivalent because we already get a validation of one of the critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm. Obviously, I'm still calling and anticipating astronomers, cosmologists to make that measurement about what occurred on the 7th and 8th of September 2021, in which a non-continuous leap or increase in the universe's expansion rate took place, I believe, according to this God's physics paradigm. But nevertheless, regardless, we have a validation because we see that the universe's accelerated rate of expansion is non-continuous. There is a gap between the initial stages of the universe's development and current measurement of the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which is much higher. So that's a validation of God's physics, one of the God's physics critical predictions. The other validation, or the other critical prediction, which was validated by this new God's physics paradigm, has to do with what's called the proton radius puzzle. That phenomena has been discovered in 2010, and till this date it could not be explained essentially by the old material causal paradigm. That phenomena briefly is that when we take, for example, a hydrogen atom, which is essentially we look at the proton radius at the nucleus of this hydrogen atom. There's a proton, and we look at the proton radius, and when we look at the proton radius, we measure the proton radius. When the standard hydrogen atom is comprises obviously of an electron encircling this nucleus of the proton and a neutron. So when we compare the proton radius value of the standard hydrogen, in which there's an electron, negatively charged electron encircling the nucleus, we compare the proton radius value of that standard hydrogen atom to a muon replaced hydrogen atom. In other words, the electron, negatively charged electron, was replaced by a muon, which is also negatively charged, but the muon is more massive than the electron. And we measure and we compare the radius of the proton in both cases, and we see that the proton radius has shrinked, has become significantly smaller in the case of the muon replaced hydrogen atom, as opposed to the standard electron hydrogen atom. And that gap, that proton radius puzzle, or gap in the proton radius value, which is decreased in the case of the muon replaced hydrogen atom, cannot be explained by the old material causal paradigm. And actually this is that these findings precisely replicate or precisely embody the unique critical prediction of God's physics paradigm. Why? Because according to God's physics new paradigm, I didn't get into that so far, but I'm just going to explain it very briefly. Remember, we spoke about the fact that the new God's physics paradigm assumes that the UCP, the universal consciousness or computational principle, is computing simultaneously all the exhaustive spatial pixels in the universe, creating the series of frames. So for each exhaustive spatial pixel, we have the UCP computing space, time, energy, and mass simultaneously. That's part, by the way, of what I mentioned earlier, the universal computational formula, which is quite amazing, but it encapsulates the manner in which this singular higher ordered universal consciousness slash computational principle is able to compute every spatial pixel in the universe, and it computes for every spatial pixel the four basic physical features of space, time, energy, and mass. So the way it computes space, time, energy, and mass is through what I call three, and more specifically two, computational dimensions. Those computational dimensions are framework, whether the UCP is computing the value of an object relative to the whole frame, its location relative to the whole frame. So framework comprises of frame, meaning the UCP is computing the value of an object relative to the whole frame, or object, whether the UCP is computing the values of an object relative to itself, its constituting values. So frame is one dimension, computational dimension, and consistency is the other computational dimension. And the combination of these two computational dimensions, UCP's computational dimensions, gives us four basic physical features of space, energy for the framework consistent, inconsistent combinations, and mass, time for object consistent or inconsistent universal computational principles computation. So we start seeing that space, time, energy, and mass are actually completely computed or produced in an integrative manner by this UCP through these two basic computational dimensions of space and of framework and consistency. I'm mentioning this here because then the new computational UCP's computational definitions of mass, for example, as one of these four: space, time, energy, and mass, or space, energy, mass, and time. The UCP's computation of the mass of a particle essentially is the degree of consistency, object consistent computation of a particle. That means that more massive particles would be presented more spatially consistent. They would be presented in more frames, and they would be presented more consistently, spatially consistent. In layman terms, that would mean that they would be more condensed. They would be smaller, and that's exactly what's happening with the proton radius puzzle. So in other words, this UCP has this God's physics new paradigm has already predicted the findings of the proton radius puzzle as one of the critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm. So again, quite amazingly, we have an initial empirical validation of God's physics unique critical prediction also in the case of the proton radius puzzle, which completely or precisely confirms the predictions or the critical prediction of this new God's physics paradigm. So we see that just as Eddington verified Einstein's general relativity theory critical prediction, single critical prediction about the double value curvature of Mercury around the Sun, we see now that the new God's physics paradigm had already two critical predictions, both of which have been verified, validated empirically in physics by the non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe, as indicated by the gap between the cosmological early measurements and contemporary astronomical measurements of the non-continuous increase in the universe's expansion, and also through the proton radius puzzle, indicating that just as God's physics new paradigm critical prediction predicts, the more massive particle, the muon particle, which affects the proton radius, would create, or the UCP's computation of the more massive muon particle would create a situation that the proton affected by this more massive particle would be more spatially consistent, or would decrease its diameter. So the proton radius, or radius, the radius of the muon replaced hydrogen atom, the proton would have a smaller radius, exactly as predicted by this new God's physics paradigm. So essentially, we have to accept, and science and scientists are accepting, they have to accept it, and they are accepting it, that the new God's physics paradigm has been empirically validated. It's the new satisfactory paradigm for 21st century physics and science more generally. That's a historic point. That's a turning point. That's a paradigmatic shift and an acceptance of this new God's physics paradigm as the satisfactory paradigm for the new 21st century science. Now I think we're at the point of starting to explore and understand what are some of the profound implications of this new God's physics paradigm. By the way, it's not just in the case of it's for science. It's a major breakthrough, and it opens exciting new vistas, new horizon for science. But as you'll see, also for humanity more generally, this new God's physics paradigm is opening tremendous, very hopeful future and understanding of the real nature of the universe and the purpose of the universe, and our unique special role as human beings within this new universe. So let me begin by perhaps highlighting a few profound new postulates of this new God's physics paradigm or computational unified field theory paradigm. And those these theoretical postulates, I'm going to try and explain them in simple terms as much as possible. One is about the development of the universe. But before I do that, I would just mention two postulates. These are the computational invariance postulate and associated universal consciousness reality postulate. Those change dramatically, profoundly our understanding of the universe. If so these postulates tells us the following. The computational invariance principle tells us that since the only thing that remains constant in the universe, remember the UCP is creating a frame, universal frame, then dissolving it, then recreating a larger frame, then dissolving it, etc., etc. And this is happening continuously from the beginning of the universe and until this point and going forward. So the computational invariance principle is telling us that since the only thing that remains constant both during the UCP's creation of a universal frame and during the dissolution of the universal frame, the only thing that remains constant both during the creation of the frames and the in-between dissolution of the frames into the UCP, the only thing that remains constant is this universal consciousness principle. In between the frames, for example, the universe dissolves, it doesn't exist. So we cannot say, according to this this computational invariance principle, we cannot continue to hold on to the view, the old material causal view, that the universe somehow is a solid material entity. It remains, it evolves. That's not the case. According to this computational invariance principle, profound new theoretical postulate of God's physics new paradigm, the only thing that remains constant both during the frames in which the UCP is creating the universe and computing these four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time for every exhaustive spatial pixel in the universe. So the only thing that remains constant both during the creation of the frames and in between the frames in which the universe dissolves into this UCP is this universal consciousness principle. As opposed to the universe and the physicality of the universe, the materiality of the universe, which is existing only temporarily, only transiently during the frames, but it dissolves, it doesn't exist, it ceases to exist between the frames. So the computational invariance principle is telling us that the only thing that remains constant and is real in a sense is this universal computational or consciousness principle. And the universal consciousness reality is telling us, taking it one further step forward and telling us that really then the universe doesn't exist as a objective, solid, continuous material entity. The universe is really only a phenomena, only a phenomenal appearance, transient phenomenal appearance of the singular reality, the only reality, the real reality of this universal conscious reality. In other words, telling us what really exists, the true nature of the universe is this universal consciousness reality, UCP, or universal consciousness reality, UCR. This universal conscious reality is the only thing that remains constant, and that universal conscious reality is manifesting, is appearing as the universe, is creating the universe and appearing as the universe for a very brief period of time, and then it dissolves back into this universal conscious reality, and then appearing again as the universe. The universe is just a transient, phenomenal appearance of the real reality of the universal conscious reality. So in other words, it's telling us there is only one reality, which is this universal conscious reality. That's the only thing that really exists, and exists continuously and constantly. The universe doesn't exist as in and of itself. It doesn't exist as an independent reality. The universe exists as a manifestation and is really just part of, it's a manifestation of the real reality, which is this universal consciousness reality. That's a very profound new understanding. That tells us that the universe has changed now. It's a new universe in a sense. The universe doesn't exist. It wasn't created by a Big Bang initial nuclear event. There couldn't have been a cause and effect. The universe is really a manifestation of this universal conscious reality, which is the only reality. So it appears as the universe for a short period of time, then it exists without the universe, but it's still the same universal conscious reality. We only have one reality, and that reality is this universal consciousness reality. And it appears temporarily, transiently, as the universe, then it goes back to itself, remains as the universal conscious reality without the universe, and then it creates again, manifest as the universe. So it's a profound change, because we understand the universe is not material, it's not causal, it's really a universal consciousness reality that's manifesting, alternating into manifest as the physical universe and then remain without the physical universe as the universal conscious reality. It's all the time this universal conscious reality. That's a very profound change. And the other thing that comes with it is an understanding. I called it the reverse time goal, Geula goal hypothesis or postulate. And that means that I give a metaphor that in the same way that you would have an architect building a palace or planning a palace, and the palace, the builders, the constructors of the palace, and all the workers that would construct the palace would not start working until before the architect, the great architect, has had a plan, a complete plan for how a blueprint of how this palace would look like, and what's the complete picture of the palace, how it's going to be constructed, what it's going to be comprised of. So none of the builders and constructors of the palace, this beautiful palace, would start working before we have the end result in the mind or on paper of this great architect. In somewhat the same manner, there is this reverse time Geula goal postulate or hypothesis, essentially saying that the universal consciousness reality has foreseen and has pre-planned the evolution of the whole universe based on the end result. The end result, the ultimate goal of the universe, of the universal conscious reality, creating the universe, the ultimate goal of the universal conscious reality creating the universe is to reach a state of Geula. Geula is the term that I borrowed or used from the Jewish tradition, the Hasidic Jewish tradition, but it doesn't matter. It means that it's a perfected moral spiritual state. And this new God's physics paradigm is telling us that the universal conscious reality has pre-planned, and is actually executing and continuously creating the universe in order to reach this ultimate Geula perfected state, this perfected moral, spiritual, and even physical state of humanity and the universe, in which that Geula, ultimate perfected state, moral, spiritual, physical, perfected Geula state, is a state in which the true reality of the universe would be realized. The true reality of the universe is the singularity of this universal consciousness reality. And so this perfected Geula state excuse me, is where the universe is evolving towards, and the universal consciousness reality has pre-planned and is actually executing the continuous development of the universe in order to reach that perfected Geula state. Excuse me. So now we start understanding, and what that means, by the way, is that the universal conscious reality has pre-planned the evolution of the universe from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and then to the perfected Geula state. That's the ultimate goal, which has been pre-planned by this universal conscious reality, just as the architect would plan the whole palace before it would start building the palace, or instruct the builders, constructors, and workers to how to build the palace. So in the same manner, this universal consciousness principle or reality, UCP or UCR's reverse time Geula goal postulate or hypothesis essentially says that this universal conscious reality has pre-planned the development of the universe from the get start, before the beginning of the universe, and throughout the evolution of the universe, and until the perfected Geula state. It's pre-planned everything from the end result, from the ultimate goal, Geula goal, of a perfected universe in which humanity, science and humanity, would realize the singularity of this universal consciousness reality. But it's pre-planned it from the inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and to the ultimate Geula perfected state. By the way, in a sense, the reason or the manifestation, the universal conscious reality's manifestation of increasingly more evolved consciousness forms. Obviously, inanimate matter has a very limited appearance or manifestation of consciousness. Then animals, plants, and then animals, and then human beings. The expression, the manifestation of this more expansive consciousness, forms of consciousness, leading to humanity's recognition, capacity and recognition of the singular, higher ordered reality of the universal conscious reality. That's the whole plan and progression of the evolution of the universe. And so this means, by the way, that this new God's physics is the first time in science that we see a complete unification of many of the factors in science and in the universe. First of all, we see a unification between biological evolution, physical evolution, you may say psychological evolution or spiritual evolution. Those are all unified, because the universe has not been created by a Big Bang initial nuclear event. The Darwin's natural selection principle is being undermined as well, negated. There cannot be any interaction between the environment and an organism, or between genetic mutation of a certain organism, which can then survive better in a challenging environment. Those interactions cannot take place because of this new acausal computational paradigm. And more generally, because we understand that the universe is dissolving all the time, and the only thing that's really sustaining the universe and evolving it, recreating it and evolving it, is this universal conscious reality. So we start realizing that the universal conscious reality is the only reality, as we said, and it's actually having a plan. It's driving the universe all the time from this inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings possessing the most expansive form of consciousness, and humanity and science reaching the ultimate goal for which the universe has been created and been evolved, and that's the ultimate Geula goal, state of perfection, moral, spiritual, and physical perfection. Maybe I'll talk for a short while about this perfected Geula state. I give the metaphor of, first of all, let me just mention another, now is the time to mention some of the unique characteristics and discoveries now by this new God's physics paradigm of this universal consciousness reality. Because we understand that the major player and the only reality, sole reality, singular reality behind the universe, creating the universe as a transient phenomenal manifestation of this universal conscious reality, the only real reality is this universal conscious reality, and it's creating the universe from the get start, from the creation of inanimate matter and the universe at large, which is all the time being expanded and accelerated by this universal conscious reality, then manifesting more evolved forms of consciousness, such as plants, then animals, then human beings, and then evolving it towards the Geula state. So another major discovery made by this new God's physics paradigm is what I call the dynamic equilibrium moral principle. And the dynamic equilibrium moral principle essentially says that since this universal conscious reality comprises a singular reality, there's nothing in the universe which can be independent and exists independently and is not created by this universal conscious reality. because of the unity and the oneness of this universal conscious reality, and because this universal conscious reality possesses a moral principle, its oneness, it's striving to steer the universe towards a perfected state, moral state. So there is an intrinsic, what I call dynamic equilibrium moral principle, essentially telling us that this universal conscious reality is possesses this moral principle, dynamic equilibrium moral principle, essentially telling us that, I give a metaphor, imagine that you had a trampoline, and that trampoline, elastic trampoline, had, let's say, 2 points, one in the one side and then another one on the other side. And if it's hard to demonstrate it here, but if we had a trampoline with 2 points connected and one of them would be pushing the other point, then the elastic fabric of the trampoline would push the other side. So when we have a situation, that's a metaphor explaining that if we have two human beings, individual human consciousnesses, that are interacting, and one of them is inflicting pain or suffering, God forbid, on the other point through this metal bar, the metal bar would push to the other side and essentially teach the first person, the first consciousness that was inflicting pain or suffering, God forbid, on the other individual human being. This would balance itself. In other words, the moral principle, the universal consciousness reality's dynamic equilibrium moral principle, teaches us that it's all the time trying to balance and teach humanity at large and human beings individually that we're all part of the same reality. So if a person inflicts pain on another person, God forbid, that person that inflicted the pain would have to experience to a certain degree the same suffering that he or she inflicted on another human being, not as a punishment again, but as a means for this universal conscious reality to teach us not to inflict pain and actually to help each other, because we're part of the same trampoline, the same universal consciousness reality. So this dynamic equilibrium moral principle is a key intrinsic property or characteristic of this universal conscious reality. And that means, by the way, that it's advancing humanity. The goal is to advance humanity towards that perfected state. I give a metaphor, a healthy, a mentally balanced human being would not use the right hand to inflict pain on the left hand. Why? Because obviously it's part of the same human being, and we would not inflict pain on ourselves. And so in the same way, the universal conscious reality is telling us that it would not allow a part of itself, all the human beings and everything in the universe is part of the same thing, but more pronouncedly, all human beings possessing an expansive form of consciousness are part of the same universal conscious reality. And the dynamic equilibrium moral principle is teaching us that one human being cannot inflict pain on another human being, because inflicting pain on the other human being essentially is violating this unity, this moral perfection of the singular reality of the universal conscious reality. So it's teaching humanity and each one of us individually to respect and to actually understand and recognize that we're all part of the same reality, this same oneness reality. And this is now also explaining to us what this perfected Geula state, ultimate goal of the universe's creation by the universal conscious reality is. Because the perfected Geula state would be a state in which not only humanity and science would recognize the oneness and singularity of the universal conscious reality, so it would understand and recognize and live by this understanding that there's only one reality. This one reality is characterized by other properties, which again I wrote about it, all goodness, morality, oneness, peace, harmony, Geula, this perfected Geula state. So we understand now that this universal conscious reality is driving the universe towards this perfected state. I would just mention also that as part of this dynamic equilibrium moral principle, it's the first time in science and in physics that we discover the fact that this universal conscious reality possesses what I call the multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all the past, present, and multiple possible futures of the universe, and for each individual human being. So if we said that the moral principle is teaching us not to inflict pain, and on the contrary, to actually assist each other, and when a human being, individual human being, chooses a moral choice to help another human being, again, this universal conscious reality would select, that's the point that I'm making now, that every human being has one of multiple possible futures embedded in the universal conscious reality, what I call multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all past, present, and multiple possible futures, universal frames for each individual human being. But so when a human being chooses a moral choice, that universal conscious reality would select one of multiple possible futures for that human being, which would reward that human being and encourage that human being to continue to do good and goodness to other human beings, and vice versa. If a human being inflicts pain or suffering, God forbid, on another human being, then he or she would have to experience something similar, which would teach them, I cannot inflict pain because that other human being is part of the same universal conscious reality, just as the right hand and left hand are part of the same human being. So we start seeing a new picture in which the universal conscious reality is evolving humanity and evolving the universe, creating the universe from the get start with the plan of creating the universe from evolving the universe from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, and to the perfected Geula state. And actually we stand now at a very exciting time. I say exciting time because humanity now, not only we have a shift from the old material causal paradigm of relativity theory and quantum mechanics to the new God's physics acausal paradigm, which is a major revolution in science, equivalent to Einstein's revolution of relativity theory 100 years ago. But even beyond that, science is reaching the point where it's starting to realize the universe is not a material entity. The universe does not exist continuously and solidly as a material entity, and it doesn't evolve by cause and effect. So that's negating the Big Bang model. It's negating the material causal assumption of Einstein's general relativity theory, which I explained. It's negating quantum mechanics assumption, material causal assumption of the collapse of the probability wave function. It's negating the existence of dark matter, dark energy as superfluous. It's negating Darwin's natural selection principle. It's a new science, it's a new universe, which is acausal computation, essentially understanding that there is really one singular reality, that one singular higher ordered reality is the universal consciousness reality, which is typified by all goodness, by morality, by its striving to peace and harmony, and striving to bring humanity towards the perfected Geula state, towards which the whole universe was created. One of the profound, beautiful articles that was published, or is about to be published, it's in press, is about resolving the greatest riddle of the universe, which is why the universe was created. This new paradigm allows us and stipulates that there is a reason for the creation and continuous evolution of the universe, which is to bring the universe toward this perfected Geula state. And we stand at a very exciting time, because we start realizing humanity, not just science, that we play a major role, that we human beings possess the most expansive form of consciousness, and in a sense the whole plan of the universe's creation and evolution towards a perfected Geula state, the whole plan and execution and evolution of the universe towards the perfected Geula state is solely for the fulfillment of the universal conscious reality's ultimate goal, Geula goal, which is a perfected moral, spiritual, and physical state, including, by the way, the possibility of time reversal, abolishment of death, many things that are very exciting, which I wrote about. But essentially we start realizing that the universe is now evolved to the point of reaching or starting an era in which the Geula perfected state will manifest. Because when science is starting to realize that there's only one reality, that reality is typified, that's the universal conscious reality. that reality is typified by all goodness, by morality, by a striving to bring the universe towards the perfected Geula state. And in fact, the new God's physics paradigm, in a sense, opens the gate, opens the door to this perfected Geula state, in which science and humanity will start realizing that we're all one, that we're all part of this universal conscious reality, that this universal conscious reality is all goodness, and that the world that we start living in and recognizing is a world of oneness, of morality, of perfection, a moral perfection, spiritual perfection. So it's a very exciting time, and again, I'm glad to deliver this, to present this video presentation, which is very exhaustive about explaining the whole, encapsulating in a brief time, relatively brief time, the whole idea of this new God's physics paradigm. I'm recording it on Kaf Kislev, which is an auspicious day for the Chabad rabbis, the third Chabad rabbi. And I'm glad to do that, because I think this message is for scientists, is for humanity at large, that we're entering a phase of this new God's physics paradigm, which is teaching science and humanity that we're really not separate from each other, that the whole goal of the universe's creation and actually guidance and supervision by this universal conscious reality is driving the universe towards a very exciting point. We're starting to enter that new era of Geula, of a perfected Geula state, moral, spiritual, physical, in which science and humanity will recognize the oneness of creation and the singular reality of this universal consciousness reality. Thank you very much.